All right, if you want to flip there a little early as I start, we're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 12. I was thinking about how we have become a throwaway society, if you haven't heard that term before. This past week, actually just last night, I sold our Kia Spectra that we'd had for I don't know how many years, 10 years or something like that. Didn't get much for it because it had a lot of issues. But earlier in the week, Johnny and I had gotten home and we were in the car, and he said to me, "We've had this car for a long time. Why don't we just fix it and then we can use it a lot longer?" And so I explained to him, well, with the amount of problems it has and how much money we'd have to put into fixing it, it's just not worth it. And that got me thinking about with how much we throw away in our society, especially like electronics. If you break your phone screen these days, a lot of the times it's almost as expensive to replace the phone screen as it is to just buy a brand new phone. So why would you replace the screen when you can just upgrade your phone, right? It's gotten so bad that from what I looked up online, in 2018, the United States alone threw out 151 million phones, which is just mind-boggling to me. I'm trying to think of the math, how many adults must have thrown out how many phones for that to work out. Maybe the estimate's a little high, I don't know. But either way, we're throwing out a lot. And what's worse is, in a lot of ways, we are also a throwaway society as far as comes to people. We throw away people. We don't want to deal with them. I met a couple of weeks ago with a volunteer from a group in town here called The Nameless, and they're a relatively new charity, and they specifically seek to help people with drug addictions. And so I met with a volunteer, and she talked about some of the things that she does, how she has a route that she takes through the city where she just goes and hands out sandwiches to people that she knows are drug addicts, and she collects used needles in a safe way and discards them. She searches in places in parks and all kinds of areas downtown where these needles get discarded. They try and help people that get discarded. If you're like me and you're part of some of our St. Thomas discussion groups on Facebook, what I've seen on there is that drug addicts are seen essentially as basically just a nuisance, almost like vermin, something we have to deal with, but they're really just a bother, instead of seeing them as human beings who have problems and addictions that they need help with. And I know that obviously a lot of problems are caused because of drug addiction, but we need to see these people with love, right? And instead we just try and kind of get rid of them. And we could see this with numerous groups in society. I mean, poor people, people on low income. I mean, what do? We try and get them out of the way, and you can see it become a problem in big cities where people in low income they're when they get geared to income housing, it's a good thing, except that we put it all together and we kind of just try and keep them in a segregated area where if problems develop there, we don't have to think about it as much. But you don't even have to look at those kind of discarded groups of people to see that we discard people. I'm sure probably all of us, for some length of time or another, have been cut out of the lives of someone that we cared about, at least for a time. And there's even a term for it, ghosting, which is a much cooler term than what it actually is. We came up with a cool term for getting rid of somebody. There's a scene about it in Friends. I don't know if you guys have watched this show Friends before, but there's a scene where a couple of characters are talking about someone that they cut out and they just hadn't spoken to in years. They just ignored them. This is how we treat other human beings. If people are too broken or too much of a hassle or too annoying, too dramatic, then we discard them. And thank God that God is not like that. God doesn't throw away damaged goods, because in one way or another, we are all damaged goods. All of us have been damaged and distorted by sin, and God would have every right to get rid of us. God who created us, who is perfect, who deserves and asks for worship, and deserves and asks for obedience, we sin and disobey him every day. He would be fully right and fully just to discard us, but he doesn't do that. And that's what we're going to be talking about, focusing on this morning. Over the last couple of weeks, we talked about how Jesus gives rest for the weary. We talked over the last couple of weeks, with the exception of Kevin being here as our guest speaker, but we talked the first week about how Jesus' yoke is easy and his burden is light. And we talked last week about how he was confronted by the Pharisees and how, especially compared to them, and how they wanted to make a burden of the commandments and God's laws. And they heaped that burden onto people, and they added so much of their own laws to it. Compared to that, especially, Jesus' burden is light and how he cares for people. And so this week we're going to continue. We looked at end of chapter 11 of Matthew. We looked at the beginning of chapter 12 of Matthew. We're going to continue now, Matthew chapter 12, starting at verse 15 and going to verse 21. So this passage gives us a number of insights into the heart of Jesus and who he is. We're going to talk about all of it, but I especially want to focus on that particular aspect of Jesus, that he doesn't turn away the broken. So let me read you Matthew chapter 12, 15 to 21. Aware of all this, Jesus withdrew from that place. A large crowd followed him, and he healed all who were ill. He warned them not to tell others about him. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. Here is my servant whom I have chosen, the one I love, in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will proclaim justice to the nations. He will not quarrel or cry out. No one will hear his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out, till he has brought justice through to victory. In his name, the nations will put their hope. So the beginning there says, aware of this, Jesus withdrew from that place. So that's talking about what we looked at the end of last week. So Jesus talks to the Pharisees. He gives them a verbal smackdown, embarrasses them in front of all these people, defies these extra commandments they had added to God's commands, and they plan to have him killed. And so, aware of that, he withdrew. And I want to stop there because I don't want us to take that for granted, that Jesus was aware of it. Jesus had a supernatural knowledge about what the Pharisees were planning the moment they started planning it. And we're like, well, of course Jesus knew. He's Jesus. But I don't want to skip past that. So healing the sick and verbally wrecking the Pharisees is not the only amazing things he was doing there. He had a supernatural knowledge, and we see that about Jesus in numerous places in the Gospels. We see a story where he's surrounded by a crowd of people, I'm sure, that are bumping into him from every side. And yet when one woman who's looking for healing touches the hem of his clothes and gets a healing, miraculously just by touching his clothing, Jesus is supernaturally aware that that's happened. He says, power has gone out from me, and he finds who that woman is. Much more important and more encompassing way with Jesus and his mission is he supernaturally knew when and how he was going to die, and he knew that he was going to rise again on the third day. So to outward appearance, it probably didn't look like the Pharisees were planning on having Jesus murdered. After all, they're religious leaders. They're supposed to be good people. But Jesus knew, because God knows the heart. God sees past that outward appearance that we all see and judge and assume about and fall for sometimes. And Jesus saw past that and saw to the heart, because Jesus is God. So other people would have been fooled by that religious exterior of the Pharisees, but we can't fool Jesus, neither could the Pharisees. And then verse 15, a large crowd followed him, and he healed all who were ill. So Jesus knows what the Pharisees are planning. He knows it's not his time to die, and so he leaves, takes off, but he doesn't just abandon the people that are in need there. They follow him, and he heals them. So there's all these people gathered around the synagogue. Jesus had showed up, essentially, for a lot of ways what we would think of as church. And he finds these people in need of healing, and after the confrontation with the Pharisees, they all leave with him. So this, first of all, this tells us they were getting something from Jesus that they could not get from the synagogue and the religious leaders. And then just to jump on something that critics of the Bible might say. Let's address something here. If Jesus is so easily, miraculously healing, crowds of people. And if God is real, somebody might say, well, why isn't God miraculously healing people all the time now? Well, first of all, I think that he is, just not as overtly through an individual going and touching and healing them. In that, I guess I'm kind of contradicting what some of our brothers in the Pentecostal churches might say, but I'll go ahead and contradict them anyway. But God still does that healing. But if somebody asks, why isn't God doing such mass miraculous healings now, as he did with Jesus in the New Testament, I would say a couple of things. I would say, first of all, God was doing a bunch of miracles in the time of Jesus, because God does a lot of miracles when he has a special message that people need to be aware of very quickly, when he's giving a special revelation to mankind. And with Jesus, God was making sure people knew this is the Son of God. This is the Messiah. And so miracles, of course, accompanied that. And of course, Jesus being God incarnate was able to do that. But we see it in the Old Testament as well. There are many miracles happening when God has a message that he needs people to be aware of, and he makes it very prominent with those miracles. And so I'm sure we will see it again, and as Revelation tells us, we will see it again in the end times, but for now, those things aren't happening. Second, I would suggest that when we think like that, what we've fallen into is the same trap that many of the Jews in the New Testament, during the Gospels, fell into themselves. You know why many of the Jews didn't believe that Jesus was the Messiah? Do you know part of the reason why his own closest disciples didn't believe him when he said he was going to die? Because they had their own expectations of what the Messiah was supposed to be and do. The Jews thought the Messiah was going to come, and Israel was under the control of the Roman Empire, and they hated it. Passionately hated being under the control of the Roman Empire. And so they thought when the Messiah comes, he's going to free our nation, he's going to make us the dominant world power, we're going to have an amazing, unbeatable military. That's what the Messiah is going to do. That's what they thought. So when Jesus came and he did not do that, then they thought, well, he must not be the Messiah. But Jesus had much bigger plans in mind. He didn't have the political salvation of a country in mind. Jesus had the spiritual salvation of the world in mind. So if we say, well, if God really existed, he would be doing more miracles and healing more people in more masses and more overtly, then we're falling into that same trap of thinking we should be able to dictate how God should act. He's not meeting our expectations, so he must not be real. It's almost like a supernatural, perfect, all-holy being who knows everything and created everything, knows more than we do. And sometimes in acts in ways we don't expect him to, and we might not always agree with. As they say, God works in mysterious ways. But in this time, Jesus was helping those people in need. He's healing those people. That also shows us the heart of God. While he might not always bring miraculous healing, he does always care. But what makes this more puzzling, though, is that next verse. We look at verse 16. He warned them not to tell others about him. Now, why would he say that? Why would Jesus heal people and then not want them to go and spread the word of what he was doing? You would think Jesus wants everybody to come rushing to him and to meet with him. And I think that there's a couple of reasons why he instead does the opposite of what we might expect him to do there. One of them is he doesn't want masses of people to come to him just for physical healing, because that's what they've heard he's doing. He came for something more important. He came to accomplish a mission. He came to spread the gospel. He wants people to come to him to hear him preach, not just because they hear about him doing healings. And in fact, even with him telling people, don't let anybody know, don't go and say what I did, they still do it anyways a lot of the times. And what we see is Jesus is surrounded and crowded by so many people that it's hard for him to move around at times. There's the one story about where he had to get out on a boat and get pushed out into the water so that he could speak to the people, because there were so many that were crowding around him all at once. Imagine, by the way, trying to speak to thousands and thousands of people at a time when their microphones did not exist. I need a microphone just to speak past this thing to make sure everyone hears me. John, can you?
I went on the water because the water
Yeah, exactly. To help bring his voice out more. You're right. The acoustics work better there. So verse 17, this was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. And so then we get this prophecy from Isaiah. It's the longest quote of the Old Testament that we find in the Gospel of Matthew, and really talks again about the heart and character of Jesus, what he cares about, how he is. Verse 18, here is my servant, God's saying here is my servant whom I have chosen, the one I love, in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will proclaim justice to the nations. Okay, so God the Father, obviously, he loves and delights in his own Son, Jesus. And Jesus has the very Spirit of God in him because he is God incarnate. He is fully God and fully man. And he proclaims justice to the nations. Justice far beyond anything that human justice can imagine or accomplish. And this is something that we, as Christians, by the way, are still called to do today. One of the most famous Old Testament passages, I think, is Micah chapter 6, verse 8, which says, he has shown you, O mortal, I love that, O mortal. He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God, or as some other translations put it, to seek justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. By the way, I realized after I got here, I'm wearing my Seek Justice shirt. That was just a nice coincidence there. But we are to seek justice as God's followers, as Christians. We're to be a voice for the voiceless, help for the helpless. We're supposed to follow the example of Jesus. The people that our society looks down on the most and discards are the ones that we are supposed to reach out to, care for, and love. And I think you can see Christianity kind of as a mass of people and as a movement, doing that many times throughout history. But we need to make sure that as individuals, we're striving to do that as well, to seek justice, to help the helpless. Follow Jesus' example here. And then in verse 19, it says, he will not quarrel or cry out. No one will hear his voice in the streets. So real quick, that's not saying, of course, that he would never speak loudly in the streets and preach in the streets. It follows after it's talking about what he says he will not quarrel or cry out. So you won't find him acting like a fool, having a loud argument in the streets with people. In other words, Jesus is going to be not picking fights with people. He's not going to be yelling at people. He's humble, incredibly humble, given who Jesus is. He is meek. He's not a fool lashing out at people. And that makes me reflect on how sometimes in social media, we argue so easily and so often with people. Not that I personally have ever done that. Not once. But that's not who Jesus is. And I think we can see as well from what Jesus knew and who he was. He could have been constantly correcting people and arguing with people, letting them know when they're wrong, but he didn't do that. He was humble and meek. And then in verse 20, and this is the verse that I really love and want to highlight this week. Verse 20, a bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out. Now, a smoldering wick is easy to imagine. I can close my eyes and I can picture what a smoldering wick looks like. A bruised reed, a little more challenging. So I got that here. This is what a bruised reed might look like. So it's still intact, but it's damaged, right? It's no longer straight and strong. When I think about this particular verse, when I think about candles, I think about a while ago, Beth used to have a candle. A friend of hers had given her a fake one. It looked really real. So real. One night I was planning a romantic evening and I lit it on fire with the other candles. It did not work after that. But when we think about what a bruised reed is used for, there were a lot of different uses back that time because there's different kinds of reeds. Dry reeds were used for things like walking sticks, arrow shafts, pipes for musical instruments. Probably what Jesus is referring to here, though, is in specific, reeds that were used for musical instruments. So what would you do if you collect a bunch of reeds that you want to use maybe for a musical instrument, and then you find one that looks like this, one that's damaged? Well, it's useless, right? Throw it out. Maybe snap it for fun first and toss it out. because you can't use it. There's no point to it. It's like if you're on a walking trail and you pick up a stick for a walking stick that you think is going to work well, and then you see a crack in it. Again, I like to snap those because for some reason that's fun. And then throw it away because you can't use it after it's been damaged. It's useless. This Old Testament prophecy written over 700 years earlier was referring to Jesus. How he sees people who are damaged. There are people out there thought of as garbage or useless that are beyond help, that are tossed aside. Sure, maybe get them a little bit of help, some maybe minimal government programs, so we don't have to hear about them as much. We feel like they're taken care of well enough that we don't have to help them. This passage is saying even people like that, Jesus is not going to toss them aside. Jesus is not going to break them. Even us, at our worst, Jesus will not discard you. Even if everyone else in this world and in your life were to toss you aside and say you're more trouble than you're worth putting up with, Jesus will not turn his back on you. You can't out-sin the love of God. You can't out-sin the grace of God. And even if you utterly fail in everything that the people of this world value, in your job, in your finances, if you failed with your family, failed with your marriage, failed with your friendships, everything that this world values, if you failed, Jesus still says, I love you because you are made in the image of God, and you are therefore inherently priceless. So priceless, so loved by God that Jesus, the Creator, Jesus, God the Son, Jesus, King of Kings, thought you were so valuable he died on a cross so that you could be saved from your sins. And of course, he rose again on the third day. I've heard it said, don't say to yourself something that you wouldn't let somebody say to one of your friends. When you put yourself down, when you think of yourself as not good enough, imagine Jesus standing next to you saying, don't talk to my child that way. Because he sees value in you. He cares about you. Here Jesus uses the reed and the smoldering wick to symbolize the people broken. It could be a believer whose faith is weak, Christian who feels like they're failing, but they keep trying. Jesus does not throw you away. I think one of the best examples in the Bible of this is the woman who is caught in adultery and is brought before Jesus. And there's essentially a mob of people that brings this woman before Jesus, trying to trap Jesus into condemning her or breaking the law. And of course, it's the famous story where Jesus picks up a stone and says, whoever is without sin, cast the first stone. There was a mob of people who saw no value left in this woman. They saw nothing but her sin. They literally thought she was so worthless, she should be killed. Of course, there's a lot more to that story and why Jesus didn't follow exactly that Old Testament law. But the heart of it is, Jesus saw that woman and the value in her. And he saw her in a way that our society and that we ourselves, if we're not careful, don't see. Value deep inside them. Jesus mends broken lives. End of verse 20, till he has brought justice through to victory, in his name the nations will put their hope. And many nations put their hope still in Jesus. A glued together vase. If we were to see a vase that had been broken and glued back together, but if we could somehow remove that vase and just see the glue itself, it could be a beautiful pattern itself. And in fact, there's some artwork that has been done that way. Or if you're a big office nerd like me, you think about how Jan in one episode broke Michael's prize Dundee trophy and tried to glue it back together, but that didn't work. Anyways, when you think of something that's been broken and glued back together, if you could just see the cracks, ignore the rest, the cracks themselves can look beautiful. And God can do that. He can see us and he can see our brokenness, and instead of throwing us away, he sees something beautiful there. He sees one of his children, one of his creations, something precious. And all of this is why Jesus died on the cross. He died on the cross to once and for all save the broken. God broke his own son to save humanity. We are broken by sin. And if we think we're not, then we're fooling ourselves. But the good news is God doesn't throw away damaged goods. He's old school, like the older generation. He fixes things instead. He fixes us instead. Through salvation, Jesus heals broken lives. Why don't we pray? Heavenly Father, we thank you for how loving a God you are, that you care so deeply about each one of us, that you love each one of us, that you have so much grace and forgiveness in your heart. And that when we fail and we sin, we make our lives look ugly through our own sin and actions, that you can still see us as your children. You still hold out your hand. You still want to help pick us up. You still want to fix us. But I pray that you would remind us of that when we are hard on ourselves, that you would remind us of that anytime we might be tempted to look down on others. That you would help us to see them as you do, with that kind of love, with that kind of grace. But we pray this in Jesus' holy name. Amen.